the gentleman very much.
Amen. Chairman Aderholt.
I have an amendment to ask, a second amendment asks for unanimous consent that the amendment be considered read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Aderholt.
Is granted. The amendment is considered read.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since we're on a bipartisan roll this morning, I think maybe we can continue on that. I have an amendment concerning funding limitation that is identical to the one that's been carried in the Commerce Justice Science Bill for 22 years. It's consistent with the Hyde Amendment. Basically, it's very simple. It restricts ICE funding of abortions only in cases of rape or where it's necessary to preserve the life of the mother. Let me reiterate that the point that I just made. This amendment is an identical provision that's been carried in the CJS bill for over 22 years, meaning that it merely reinstates a limitation that applied to detention operations under the now-defunct Immigration and Naturalization Service, or better known as INS, for years, and before the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Second of all, given that, it's simply codifying a policy that ICE already adheres to and has been following for since the inception of the department in its detention standards. Third, those who may raise objections, let me say you voted for this provision for this very purpose in the past and have not raised objections in the CJS bill. Matter of fact, I think most members probably thought that this actually was already codified in the Department of Homeland Security, and so I would respectfully ask the adoption of the amendment.
Mr. Price.
Mr. Chairman, I must oppose this amendment. I believe it to be unnecessary. I also believe it to be provocative. Almost 40 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that the U.S. Constitution protects a woman's right to choose reproductive freedom. That decision has been the law of the land, but it's been under constant attack since the day it was rendered. These attacks have never been more strident than they are today, with attacks on women's reproductive freedom now extending even to contraception. Numerous restrictions in law have already conditioned and qualified reproductive choice in practice. Among those prohibitions on the use of federal funds, are prohibitions on the use of federal funds for abortion procedures. They are specifically applied to ICE and the Department of Homeland Security by President Obama's Executive Order 13535, issued on March 24th of 2010. Now, many of us believe these restrictions are excessive, but they are a settled matter. And I have to wonder what purpose is served, except possibly a political purpose, in bringing this redundant amendment before us today. I should note it's redundant with one significant exception. The executive order contains an exemption for cases of incest, while the Aderholt Amendment contains no such exception. Now, ICE already follows the procedures laid out for the Bureau of Prisons, prohibiting the use of federal funds to provide abortions. In fact, ICE hasn't paid for an abortion throughout the entire course of the Obama administration, and any services provided by ICE in the last decade have been solely for post-miscarriage care. Nothing in this bill changes those facts. So this amendment is simply picking an unnecessary political fight, or perhaps playing to the galleries. Our Homeland Security bill has never touched on the issue of abortion because it's not relevant to the Department of Homeland Security. It falls far outside the lines of jurisdiction of this subcommittee. So why cast aside the bipartisan and the cooperative effort we have shared in crafting this bill for a redundant, politically charged amendment that accomplishes nothing and makes no change whatsoever in current law or procedure? I urge colleagues to reject this amendment.
Further discussion? Judge Carter.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of Chairman Aderholt's amendment. This is basically, he is restating the current law that's been in effect for decades now. It's common sense. It's good policy. And I rise for no other political purpose whatsoever. I believe that this is what we have been acting under in good faith, but the lack of oversight, we did not find that we had actually adopted. I commend the chairman for adopting it, and I support this amendment.
Ms. Loy.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong opposition to this amendment, and it's really disappointing that with the strong cooperation and the collegial atmosphere between the chair and the ranking member, and I've served on this committee a long time, that this issue should even be brought up at this time. Let me say very clearly, the Homeland Security bill is not the place for divisive riders. I've served on this subcommittee, the Homeland Security Authorizing Committee, and in that time, I've met with first responders, ICE agents, Border Patrol, many other security personnel. Not once have they said that women's reproductive health makes their job more difficult. Not once have I heard this. And I think this is an important point to bring up again at this time, how extraneous this amendment is. Our focus should be to equip them with the tools they need to keep us safe. Weighing down this bill with ideological riders is a disservice, frankly, to all first responders that we want to assist. Our constituents expect us to provide for the needs of our first responders, prevent terrorism, secure our borders. I ask my colleagues to absolutely vote against this amendment. It does not belong in this bill, and it really spoils the bipartisan cooperation that we've had. And I thank you. Yield back.
Further discussion? Mr. Laurel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I, too, rise in strong opposition to what is, I believe, as Mr. Price has said, a politically motivated amendment. It seems that once again the majority is trying to use every single corner of the budget to write in ideological preferences. And in this case, that's to limit the rights of women, to limit their choices, and to limit their access to reproductive choices. They want to set this into law even when they are redundant and unnecessary. There seems to be people who are consumed with restricting women's rights. And I have to ask the question, why? Why do we want to do that? This is the Homeland Security bill. It should be focused on core security functions of our nations, including the funding has been pointed out for our first responders. We should be debating substantive issues that really regard the safety, the security of our nation. And instead, it seems that the majority wants to spend the markup grinding the same sorts of ideological access against women's health over and over again. In fact, the amendment is redundant multiple times over. Both the Hyde Amendment, as Mr. Price pointed out, the President's Executive Order 1353, they already prevent federal funds from being used to provide abortions with limited exceptions. And in fact, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement already follow the standards of the Bureau of Prisons, once again making the amendment duplicative. I have a copy of the letter that was sent by Mr. Norton, who heads up U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Very, very quickly, he concludes, ICE considers these amendments unnecessary. He says that, and he notes the exception that has been made with the exclusion of incest in this iteration. And he says that the language is essentially duplicative of ICE's current policy with that one exception that I have mentioned. And again,
will the gentlelady yield just for on that point? Sure. I would like to hear the chairman's reasoning about why we, instead of using the Hyde Amendment as it's been historically written, why did we drop out incest, which is just it just is inflammatory.
Damn good question.
Yep.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Well, I think the chairman is going to answer the question.
Gentlelady has the floor.
Yeah, she yielded to me, and I'm asking the
chairman,
question.
I also want to have time to conclude what I want to say, but
Yeah,
I think that the question is a valuable question to get answered. Why would we exclude
You mean address now or when my closing comment?
No, I think we want you to address it now.
Okay.
If you would.
Number one, the language. We wanted to make this language as non-controversial as possible, so we just pulled what everybody has already voted on and supported in the CJS bill and simply put it into this bill. We could have written some more language that have been very comprehensive.
Then why not? Can we, by unanimous consent, put back in incest?
Is that language in the CJS bill? It's not in the CJS. We could have opened all can of worms, and a lot of people came to me, and I came purposely, and I said, let's not make this controversial. Let's just pull the language that every member has always supported, what they've already voted on.
The traditional Hyde language says a victim of rape or incest.
Okay, this has never been an issue on the CJS bill for 22 years. We've always voted on it. It's always been an issue where that the ICE standards make an exception for incest, and it's always been rape is when every instance.
Well, maybe we've made a
Chairman?
mistake for 22 years, but I think it's time to correct the mistake.
Like I said, we could have opened this up to a lot of people had a lot of theories how this ought to be done, but to expand it, and a lot of members.
My time. The point is that this is redundant, but in fact, if you're going to look at this, we are going to exclude cases of incest, so that if women are victimized by incest, they are not protected. You know, I have to comment. The
Time of the lady is expiring. The lady has 15 seconds.
Well, first, in that 15 seconds, I really want to commend Mr. Rogers. I want to commend Mr. Price, who for the last 8 years have not put in such language and amendments. And I will classify these languages. We should not be wasting our time on this issue. It's a political amendment, and the amendments really demonstrate a lack of trust in women, and they are designed to demean and to humiliate women. And I urge my colleagues to reject these amendments.
Mr. Chairman?
Time of the gentlelady has expired.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Hubbardson?
If I could, sir, I think that incest is implied. Obviously, a case of incest. In the case of incest, incest is implied. Where there's obviously a rape, is certainly that's going to include the case of incest. An executive order also can be rescinded anytime. All this amendment does is put in statute what the Congress has uniformly and in the past almost unanimously supported, that is prohibiting the use of tax dollars for abortion. A statutory requirement is one that's been in place for a long time. The prohibition against using tax dollars for abortion has been repeatedly reaffirmed by Congress over the years, and an executive order can be rescinded at any time. So I support
the gentleman yield?
Yes, certainly. Yes, ma'am.
Would you be open to amending the gentleman's amendment to include the word incest?
I certainly would have no objection to that, but the word incest is implied. Certainly, in the case of incest, it's going to be a rape automatically, and the agency will. That's going to be non-consensual. It's certainly going to be non-consensual. But personally, I'd have no objection to including incest. But it is an executive order. It can be rescinded at any time.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, certainly, Mr. Chairman.
One thing I want to point out that, as I mentioned, this language has been in the CGS bill for 22 years.
Would the chairman yield?
And also,
on that point.
Gentleman has
let me
the
finish.
time.
And also, it should be remembered that the minority was in the majority on the CJS bill just recently, and there was never any mention of this during that time.
Gentleman yield. Obviously,
the gentleman has the time.
Sure,
Mr. Culberson,
of course.
There's obviously a contradiction in what's in CJS and what's in Labor H. Labor H is the bill that originally I worked for Senator Magnuson at the time when this was all debated 40 years ago. And the language is right here. If the pregnancy is the result of an act of rape or incest, that is the Hyde language. And what we're saying is, let us go back and we'll correct all of these things and use the Hyde language.
I know
as
Chairman,
written.
Certainly, and I know Chairman Aderholt's intent is to keep the language consistent. That's obviously the intent as expressed.
This is the FY12 HHS appropriations bill.
Well, I want to make sure, I rise in support of the amendment. I'm confident Mr. Aderholt is going to do everything he can to keep the language consistent, but it's important that we do this in statute because an executive order can be rescinded at any time, and this has been repeatedly voted on and supported by the Congress in previous sessions since 2003, and I'm confident Mr. Aderholt will find a way to keep the language consistent throughout all of these bills.
Mr. Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to offer a secondary amendment to add the word incest in the language.
You need this? That's the HHS.
Yeah, no, well, I don't actually, Mr. Chairman, for what it's worth, I staffed the abortion issue under Norm for Chairman Magnuson at the time.
But before the gentleman proceeds further, we'll need that in writing. Yeah, if you would withhold your comments until we get the language, if the gentleman would please. Please submit the language, then I'll recognize you.
All right, that's fair enough.
Ms. Lee.
Strong opposition to this amendment, and I believe that this debate that we're having is shows exactly why we should not be amending this bill into this Homeland Security bill. Reproductive health has nothing to do with Homeland Security, and you know, members, you know, some have questioned why myself and others call this a war on women. Well, this is exactly why. This has nothing to do with Homeland Security. It's just another attack and an assault on women's reproductive health. It is a war on women. Just understand that. And again, this is an example of why women feel at this point in history that so much is going on by members of Congress that's turning back the clock to the days that we all remember. And so I hope that this amendment is defeated. I hope that those who question why we call this a war on women, they see this as another example of an assault and an attack on women's reproductive health. I want to yield the balance of my time now to the gentlelady from Connecticut.
I thank the gentleman.
Gentlelady needs to remain standing.
My voice is loud enough. I thank the gentlelady. It really is, and where I ended, I will begin this piece, is that this is about a distrust of women. It is about demeaning women, and it is about humiliating women. And it happens over and over and over again. When the director of ICE writes a letter to the ranking member of the committee and lays out very specifically that the language is duplicative and that, in fact, ICE considers the amendments unnecessary, why would we take this up on the Homeland Security bill when really at a prior time, with prior chairs of this subcommittee, have understood the nature of the bill and its safety and security issues and not tried to inject something that would create divisiveness around a security issue. It is wrong, it is politically motivated, and it really says that this is the only weapon or tool that you have to create divisiveness. And that's to move at women's basic rights. Think about it carefully as you look at what this is all about. And I hope that the people here who understand that this is the wrong way to want to go after the other side of the aisle by going after women. It is wrong.
Reclaiming my time, we have a few more seconds. I just want to say in conclusion that we all know these amendments, this amendment is unnecessary. If it's unnecessary, then just why are we doing it is the question.
Chairman Aderholt.
Oh, let me give you, when this, matter of fact, I thought this language was already in this bill. I didn't realize it wasn't. I think most members, as I said, thought it was already because the department's been going by this language. The reason that we did not expand the language is because it was approached to us to try to expand the language, and we said, in a bipartisan effort, we'll accept the language just as the members have voted on for 22 years and have accepted and never objected to, and like I said, the minority has supported when they were in the majority. And so there was no intentions of any political intent in this. And I don't know anything about a war on women. Matter of fact, if I go home and my wife finds out that I didn't put this in, she might have war on me. So this is not. I know at least there's one woman that I know of that is very much in favor of this. But with that said, and if there is a concern about this, I would accept the gentleman's amendment that we include it and we expand it to that, and we'll go beyond what was already been voted on.
Mr. Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was somewhat at a loss in submitting the amendment because the section didn't have an.
Does the gentleman have an amendment?
Yep.
Clerk will read.
Amendment by Mr. Moran to the amendment by Mr. Aderholt after rape in line 4, add or incest.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the chairman's agreement to include this. I doubt that it's going to change the ultimate vote on whether the language should be included or not, but I do think it's an important correction. Let me just say that in reference to what Ranking Member Dick said, we did debate this extensively. Now it's longer ago than most of the staff, at least, in this room were alive.
40 years.
But 40 years ago. I do recall Senator Ed Brooke at the time, who was the ranking Republican on the Appropriations Committee, making the point that at least we should have exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. But in doing so, he said 95% of the Appropriations Committee are men. And he made the point that perhaps one day when there are more women that we will take a different approach to this language. Well, we made some progress. I see that 18% of this Appropriations Committee are women, but it still means that more than 80% are men. I do think these are the kinds of things that not only are inappropriate for us to be determining what happens to a woman and the control of her own body, but we get into these issues with regard to incest, which really aren't, I don't think, appropriate subjects even for debate, but certainly the addition of this language, which is consistent with what most of the language dealing with abortion exemptions does include. Now that we're aware of the CJS language, this is kind of a correction that addresses an unintentional omission to some extent. I don't refute why the chairman has the language.
If the gentleman would yield,
I think it's appropriate to now include the language now that we are aware of it.
If the gentleman would yield, the chairman's agreed to your amendment.
Yeah. And so with that, I appreciate the chairman's discussion.
Is there discussion on this secondary amendment? Yes. Ms. Kaptur.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm listening to this debate, and we all want to do what's right. But I don't know how many of you have traveled the border, but if you could imagine, and maybe Kay Granger has, but there are many women from countries south of ours that are enlisted in the drug trade, prostitution, and I was trying to imagine who might be in ICE detention. I've never been in an ICE unit down there at the border, but I have traveled the border on both sides. Judge Carter, you probably have too. And you've seen hundreds of women who've been murdered and buried upside down with their heads in the ground, all unresolved, no prosecutions. And I'm just saying to myself, as we debate this, there's a human face on this that is very, very important as we think about who might be in detention if they survive the trip across the border and what they might be facing. I have never been subjected to meeting any of them, but I can only imagine the horrors that many of them face in their personal lives. So as we move towards some type of resolution at the Department of Homeland Security, I just hope that each of us thinks about a compassionate approach to the women who survive those very rough journeys and what they might actually be facing from the cultures from which they come and what they might be enduring because of the fact that really they aren't free. They really aren't free in their own lives, and many of them pay the highest price in the circumstances that they are entrapped in. So I would hope that we would find a way to provide compassionate care and not be repressive or vindictive or in any way harm these women. And I just wanted to put those personal thoughts on the record as we proceed.
The pending business before the committee is the secondary amendment of Mr. Moran adding incest to the bill. Is there discussion on that secondary amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I think the addition of the incest exception to the main motion is prudent and is consistent with existing practice. I have to say, though, that it does not really qualify my opposition, and I think the opposition of many, to the inclusion of this language in the Homeland Security bill. And if there's any impression that this aspect of the Homeland Security drafting process and markup process has had the slightest bipartisan flavor to it, I have to correct that. I and I think many on our side have seen this as an unnecessary, provocative distraction from the beginning.
Mr. Farr.
Old legislative adages don't mend a bad provision, and I think that the original provision is a bad provision. And I say this, I mean, we're having quite a debate today on the floor on a significant bill that was first adopted by Congress, and many of us voted for that back in 1994, a real historic bill outlining in law crimes against women, Violence Against Women Act. And that bill's up today. We reauthorized that bill in 2000. We reauthorized it in 2005. And for the first time since that bill's been in law, we're now taking away a woman's ability under a violent situation to report and have any remedies. And it seems to me that this amendment comes on top of that. And I have to tell you, Mr. Aderholt, you talk about how your wife would be upset. I rise as a brother of a sister. I rise as a husband of a wife. I rise as a father of a daughter. And I rise as a grandfather of a granddaughter. And those are women in my life who are very concerned about the attitude that's being taken here publicly to take away a woman's right to choose. I also rise, I used to be a first responder. In college, I was a wildland firefighter. Responded to these fires, and what was remarkable is the number of women that were there as first responders, working as co-equals among us. It just seems the message we're giving, you know, whether it was in the original legislation, first of all, it doesn't have to be in an appropriations bill at all, but even that we're moving in these directions is just takeaways from women. It's a war on women, and it's got to stop. You can't expect to have equal access to law, equal access to remedies, including health care remedies, if you're denying a woman a right to choose. A right to choose when they've been raped. My God, we don't even allow women in uniform in the United States military to get an abortion in our hospitals. They're assigned to seize. This just adds to that, it seems to me, and it's got to stop. We're gonna do it in this bill. We're gonna do it on the floor today. The war on women has got to stop. My daughter always reminds me, Dad, just remind those white males that you're serving with in Congress that dominate this debate, that the majority of voters this November will be women. Thank you.
Does Mr. Moran wish to claim time to close? Wait, if you withhold. Judge Carter.
Mr. Chairman, because I was up in committee with Mr. Aderholt, I want to say that I also approve of the amendment that he has agreed to, and will state, because my name was brought up on the issue of the border, that in almost 21 years of trying both aggravated sexual assault of a child and aggravated sexual assault cases, as well as over 20,000 family law cases, I can tell you that the only cases of incest that I have seen in that career, and there were about 12 of them, my rough recollection, all originated from across the border. So for that reason, I think this is a good amendment.
Mr. Moran, close.
So you get raped across the border, but you don't get remedy.
I agree with Mr. Farr that you really can't perfect a very imperfect amendment from our point of view, but I think we've discussed the issue enough, and in the sake of comedy, let's just move forward on this provision.
The vote is on the secondary amendment of Mr. Moran to add to the exceptions incest. All in favor of that amendment say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes have it. The secondary amendment is agreed to. And now we are in final discussion of the amendment as amended. Mr. Rothman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to associate myself very strongly with the views of those against the Aderholt Amendment. The amendment does not belong in this bill, number one. But I wanted to take the floor at this hearing to make it clear that there are many of us on this committee and in the Congress and the majority of the people of the United States who object to the majority's effort to restrict a woman's right to choose. That there are the majority in the United States who support Roe versus Wade, saying we trust women and we want women to have control over their bodies within the restrictions or constraints of Roe versus Wade. And that all of these additional restrictions, additional constraints that the Republican majority wants to impose on a woman's right to choose are not only wrong, in my opinion, morally, they're unconstitutional, violative of Roe versus Wade. Now, I know my colleagues on the other side of this issue feel the same way as a matter of conscience, that their views they hold as a matter of conscience, as I hold my views in support of a woman's right to choose as a matter of my conscience. But the court has ruled on this in Roe versus Wade, and I object strongly, not only to the inclusion of this extraneous provision in this in this bill, but also the notion that it's acceptable in America, that the view of the gentleman and the majority that they want to restrict and further confine a woman's rights to do what she feels she needs to do to protect her own health. That those efforts are wrong, in my opinion, morally and unconstitutional. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hearing no further discussion, Mr. Aderholt is recognized a minute to close.
Thank you. And let me just say to Ranking Member Price, if you recall, I was actually going to include this in the bill, underlying bill, and because of you had asked me to pull that in bipartisanship, I pulled that from the bill so we could bring it up, and you thought that was the appropriate thing to do, so you said there was no bipartisanship. I'm a little disappointed because you were you were very thankful that I had said you really appreciated my efforts to do that, and I thought we were working in a bipartisan effort.
If the gentleman will yield, I did appreciate the fact that this was not included in the chairman's mark,
and I did that at whose request?
And you did that at my request, and so it's before us now. But it seemed to me that your earlier comments were implying some sort of bipartisan parentage of this provision, some kind of bipartisan ownership of this provision.
Years.
And that of course I never indicated.
Time has expired on the amendment. All in favor of the Aderholt Amendment as amended will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no.
No.
The ayes seem to have it. The
Mr. Chairman, we would like a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote will raise your hand. A sufficient number. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Aderholt.
Aye.
Mr. Aderholt, aye. Mr. Alexander. Aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Austria. Aye. Mr. Austria, aye. Mr. Bishop. No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Bonner. Aye. Mr. Bonner, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter. Aye. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cole. Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Crenshaw. Aye. Mr. Crenshaw, aye. Mr. Culberson. Aye. Mr. Culberson, aye. Ms. DeLauro? Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Dent? Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Dix?
No.
Mr. Dix, no. Mrs. Emerson? Mrs. Emerson, aye. Mr. Farr?
No.
Mr. Farr, no. Mr. Fatah?
No.
Mr. Fatah, no. Mr. Flake? Mr. Frelinghuysen? Mr. Frelinghuysen, aye. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, aye. Mr. Hinchy?
No.
Mr. Hinchy, no. Mr. Honda?
No.
Mr. Honda, no. Mr. Jackson?
No.
Mr. Jackson, no. Ms. Captor?
No.
Ms. Captor, no. Mr. Kingston?
Aye.
Mr. Kingston, aye. Mr. Latham? Aye. Mr. Latham, aye. Mr. La Tourette? Aye. Mr. La Tourette, aye. Ms. Lee?
No.
Ms. Lee, no. Mr. Lewis?
Aye.
Mr. Lewis, aye. Mrs. Lowy?
No.
Mrs. Lowy, no. Mrs. Lummis?
Aye.
Mrs. Lummis, aye. Ms. McCullum?
No.
Ms. McCullum, no. Mr. Moran?
No.
Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Nunnally?
Aye.
Mr. Nunnally, aye. Mr. Olver?
No.
Mr. Olver, no. Mr. Pastor?
No.
Mr. Pastor, no. Mr. Price?
No.
Mr. Price, no. Mr. Reberg?
Aye.
Mr. Reberg, aye. Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Rothman?
No.
Mr. Rothman, no. Ms. Roybal Allard? Ms. Roybal Allard, no. Mr. Schiff?
No.
Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Serrano?
No.
Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Visklosky?
No.
Mr. Visklosky, no. Mr. Wolf? Mr. Womack?
Aye.
Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Yoder?
Aye.
Mr. Yoder, aye. Mr. Young?
Aye.
Mr. Young, aye.
Are there members who wish to be recorded? Mr. Flake?
Mr. Flake, aye.
Members wish to change their vote? Clerk will tally. Do you have any other amendments? On this vote, the yeas are 28, the nays are 21. The amendment is agreed to.